So I really just want to touch on a couple of items today. Just first, like, what is LabKey SQL? Like, how do you understand it? What's its role in the server, and what's it capable of doing? Second, let's take a look at some use cases and when it's really appropriate to use LabKey SQL. When is it best used for your data? And then let's really begin working with SQL, like where in the server can I engage it? How do I actually use it on my data? And I'll have a few examples to look at, and then have a Q&A at the end. So what is LabKey SQL? Well, I think, I always say this, so I'm sure that I can hear the developers already objecting in the background, but I think from a perspective of adding value to your data, it's the most important feature in the server. LabKey SQL really is the beating heart of the server. It's what brings data out of the database and puts it in the browser for everyone to see. And it does it in both a structured way, but in a highly flexible way. And it really helps you squeeze the most out of your data, more than really anything else, I think. It's also a SQL dialect. It's a way of speaking this language. It's the language of databases. It's how you, SQL is a whole family of different dialects, but they all speak to databases. They all pull data out of databases. And this is just our internal version of it. The one we also present to users and give you a chance to pull the levers and write SQL in LabKey SQL. It really, it stands for SQL, stands for Structured Query Language, and you should really take query seriously there. It lets you ask questions of your data. It's really about interrogating your data. So, you can often really, whenever I have to write some SQL, I often will begin with an English question. I'll ask something like, well, it helps first clarify what you're trying to do. So you can often start out by saying, well, what I really want to know is, which cohort performed the best on this metric body weight, or on this metric immune score. And then once I kind of write that out in English, actually, every time I code, I actually write it out in English, even JavaScript. I'll actually start with just a series of comments and just write out in English what I'm trying to do. Same thing with SQL. The beauty of SQL is that it's also one of the easiest languages. Like if you've never done any coding at all, I really recommend SQL as a great starting point, because you can, first of all, start in English very effectively, and then your translation into the actual syntax of SQL is fairly easy, relatively easy. The answers you get back from the database are result sets. They're called result sets. LabKey Server then does a further set of operations on those and displays those result sets as grids in the UI. And here's just a quick example of what SQL syntax looks like. This would be, if I started out in English, it would be like something like this. Would be a very simple question. In English, it would be, what are the weight, temperature, and pulse columns? What is the weight, temperature, and pulse data from the physical exam table in the database? Well, if you ask that question, it looks like this in SQL. And when it answers, it looks like this in the browser. You get back a good old LabKey data grid. And notice that we really wrap your result sets in all kinds of tooling. And you can sort of get a sense of that already from this screenshot. Take a look at that. There's a red value here, 38. This is due to a little bit of metadata that I layered on top of this result set. Also, these are links right here. The blue color here indicates that these are clickable links. That's also kind of another layer we wrap on top of your result sets. And then there's also all the tools up here. These are like the tool buttons of any LabKey data grid. You can use the graphical interface to customize the grid. You can use the graphical interface to build reports on top of this grid, et cetera, et cetera. And here's a kind of just a graphical picture of everything I've been talking about. I kind of think of the whole LabKey environment as having 3 levels. There's the browsers, which talk to the server, which kind of hovers over the databases. That's what those green shapes are. And a particular request would sort of come in through the browser. You're asking through the browser for something from the server. The server will then often interpret that request and will consult the database. The database will then provide a result set, which stimulated by a query, and then that would be redisplayed or packaged with all the trimmings and displayed as a grid in the browser. So there are some really key features to LabKey SQL that really set it apart from just any old SQL dialect. There's more than I can even list here in the time allowed, but I think these are some of the most important ones. First, there's enormous security advantages. It gives you a way to control access to the database in a way that's a lot easier than if you're just a database administrator trying to give out access all alone without any sort of application layer. It also, LabKey SQL, forms a translation layer between all of the other SQL dialects. You really only need to speak one language, or excuse me, one dialect to talk to all these other databases, and we'll get into that a little more detail on that. Also, it's important to remember that LabKey SQL actually is really quite limited in that it's only read-only. You can't update data with LabKey SQL. You can't insert data with LabKey SQL. It is explicitly about querying data, interrogating data, asking questions about the data, and getting back the data. But you're not supposed to, you can't update or change the data with LabKey SQL, and that's a good thing. So kind of as an admin, you don't really have to worry about what am I doing when I give somebody access to LabKey SQL. And then there's a lot of features, other features that go beyond ordinary SQL, and we'll get into those when we get there. Just a little bit more on the security advantages. LabKey SQL really gives you, or the LabKey SQL in combination with the server UI, give you really fine-grained access control over the databases. The server UI really acts like an intermediary to the databases. So you can do things like control who can see into the databases. You can require that people log in before they can see anything out of the databases. And also, the folder security framework really provides you an easy way to subset data in the databases. So you can say, I really just want these users who have access to this folder to be able to see these groups of tables, but not those other groups of tables. That's already an enormous advantage that you're getting with LabKey Server. And actually, although frankly, that in itself is fairly kind of coarse granularity, by some additional mechanisms, you can really achieve query level and row level access control over the database. And I'm thinking here of using something like a mechanism like a linked schema. When you're using a mechanism like that, what you're doing is you may have, say, a folder, in say folder A, you have a large group of data that's kind of undifferentiated and sort of unseparated. It may be a mix of sensitive data and data that you want to show, but only to a select audience. So what you can do is you can use LabKey SQL and build a query inside of folder A that just isolates out that data that you want to show, the safe data for that one audience. Well, now that's not quite enough, because if you let people into folder A, they're going to see that query along with the big ball of data that it came from. But you can add an additional mechanism called the linked schema and move that query. You can project that query you built in folder A and show it in folder B. Now, because of the folder framework in the server, you can specify or configure independent security for those two folders. So now you've got your query, which isolates out that data, shown in folder B, and you can let whoever you want into folder B or not in folder B. So anyways, you've got a great mechanism for row level control there. We'll go over that in detail during my training. And also another great advantage that the folder framework gives you is it gives you kind of control over the scope of a query. Oftentimes, data containers in LabKey, like say a list or an assay design, can actually span multiple folders in LabKey. Like for example, an assay design, you can define it up at the project level at a top level folder, but then that design, that shape, is available in all of the subfolders. The data itself is kind of can be sprinkled throughout that folder structure. Could be some up in the project, could be some in this subfolder, some in this other subfolder. Well, LabKey SQL gives you a really easy way to query really all those combinations of folders. It lets you say, I want this query to just scope over that one project. Or I want the query to scope over the whole project and all of its children, or anything in between. So those are just a few kind of quick sketches of some of the security advantages you get with LabKey SQL. This would be very difficult to do if you didn't have the server and you didn't have LabKey SQL. Another great advantage is by speaking LabKey SQL, you really get to speak a bunch of other SQL dialects without even knowing it. That's because LabKey SQL automatically translates your query into Postgres dialect, Microsoft SQL dialect, Oracle dialect, MySQL dialect, and maybe even some others I'm forgetting. This really lets you sort of forget about these other dialects, which is really nice. And here's just a small example of what I'm talking about. Take the syntax around concatenation. Microsoft SQL Server uses this function. If you want to concatenate the first name and the last name, you would use this kind of a syntax, and you'd get back the full name in your result set. Well, Postgres gives you this cool sort of inline style. You want to concatenate the first name and the last name, you can use these double pipes. And then you can get back the full name in your result set. Well, LabKey SQL just lets you forget all that. I don't need to know all those details. In LabKey SQL, you can just use these pipes. And again, just to repeat, LabKey SQL is explicitly a read-only language. You don't have to worry about your users inadvertently updating or inserting or whatnot when they're using LabKey SQL. You use other mechanisms in LabKey to do that, like the web UI or the API or whatever, but not LabKey SQL. And there's really more than I can say about this fact, LabKey SQL. This is like LabKey SQL is, it goes beyond just an ordinary SQL dialect. There's all kinds of additional layers and value adds to the dialect. First thing that comes to mind is just lookups. You know, lookups are, you can all, they're a way, lookups are a way to capture the relational side of databases. They're a way to capture, they're a way to make one table link to another table and get its values from another table. Just saying the word lookup really already gives you a sense of the intuitive nature of the relationship and how it works. It's a much more intuitive way to understand what's under the covers, which are foreign key relationships or primary key, the relationship between a primary key and a foreign key. And it kind of, if you don't know what I'm talking about, don't worry about it. You just have to understand the concept of a lookup, which is really shot through the entire server and is really pretty easy to understand, I think. There's also a very powerful annotation layer and query metadata layer. These are like properties or annotations that you can layer onto your queries. We already saw a little hint of it earlier when one of the values was displaying in red. That I forget, it was like one of the temperature values was displaying in red, and that's because I layered onto my query some metadata. I layered on a rule that said, if you have a value that's over 37 Celsius, I want to see it in red, if that's what you were seeing there. This whole feature set is really quite extensive. And if you know LabKey SQL and you know a little bit about query metadata, you can really go very far. Also, we've recently done a lot of work on lineage as part of the sample manager efforts. And we've also introduced relatively recently the ability to query into those lineage relationships so that your queries can ask questions like, I want to see all of the cell lines that are parents of this file here. And this is a really fairly technical topic. I don't want to get into it too much, but right now, but we can look at this more carefully during the training sessions. And also, we also give you similar ability to query into ontology hierarchies. So if you have brought in the ontology module to help annotate, say, a field in one of your tables, we let the SQL, LabKey SQL queries also ask about what's the ontology hierarchy like for this particular field I'm looking at. We also give you the ability to write parameterized SQL statements. This is a really powerful way to make your SQL more versatile. And we actually have an example of that if we have time. We also give you all kinds of debugging tools around SQL. I mean, Adam, and I think Josh mentioned this earlier, we've really improved the execution plan viewer for SQLs. This is for administrators who are trying to debug or optimize the performance of a SQL query. And also, many of the functions that are native to Postgres and Microsoft SQL Server, we just pass through into LabKey SQL. So if your underlying database is Postgres, you're not just shielded from the native functions that are in Postgres. We let you use them right inside of LabKey SQL. So some use cases, like when should I use LabKey SQL? Well, I think the main use case is really about refining table display. It's about making your data focused, compelling, relevant. It's really about focusing on the insight that's in your data. And that's really the main benefit of SQL. It's really one of the main benefits of LabKey Server. And I'm talking about just really simple things. It's easy to forget about how powerful it is to just choose the right columns to show in your table. You don't want to show a bunch of cruft and a bunch of distracting columns. You want to show the really relevant columns. You also want to be able to filter out the values that you don't want that get in the way. You want to really focus on, like, I really just want to see, values that indicate high temperature in the organism, not low temperature or regular temperature in the organism, something like that. Also, just simply sorting your values, again, can really make a big difference in, like, is this data compelling? Like, does my audience really going to see what I'm trying to get across to them? Also, joining data is just a mainstay of LabKey Server in general, and LabKey SQL. We really give you lots of easy ways to take two tables and put them together and show them together. So first point, most important, is just compelling table display. Second, LabKey SQL is a great foundation for building reports and dashboards. What I mean by this is it's a really common practice to first refine your grid display, your table display, using LabKey SQL. So you're going to use LabKey SQL to get the relevant data, and then you're going to pass that relevant data to your report mechanism, whether, say, it's a graphical report or some kind of aggregating report or whatever it is. And then that's just a really powerful pattern to use in the server. We really recommend that you kind of pass the data through those kind of transformations to build an effective report, and then ultimately multiple reports inside of a dashboard. Also, if you want to work with calculated columns, LabKey SQL is really a great way to do this in the server. We're going to do some more work on this next year, as Adam pointed out, but right now, calculated columns are something that you do inside of LabKey SQL. Also, LabKey SQL is a great way to surface other databases. Like if you, say, have legacy data in some other database, we give you a really easy way to first just attach to that database and load that data into the server UI. And now you don't even know, it might be Oracle, it might be MySQL. You don't know the dialect. You don't need to know the dialect. You can now just speak to using LabKey SQL to that database, and you're off and running. And another great use case for LabKey SQL is when you need to pre-analyze or pre-join data when it's really expensive. Like you just have a lot of data, or you have a lot of processing to do, or a lot of complicated joins to do on the data. It can be really great to write that complicated query and, say, load it into a flat table that like a staging table, where you can then go take that data and move it on to the next step. And so, like, ETLs are just a classic example of that. You've got the ETL can go and grab all this data from all these different places and just load it into a simple query for then the next step in that data's journey. So there's more, I'm sure there's more that we could say about use cases there. It's kind of endless, but let's take a look now at just working with LabKey SQL, and sort of how to do it. Like, where do you start? And the start for any journey with LabKey SQL is the query browser. And if you've never seen this before, this is what you're looking at here is a catalog of all of the queries that are available inside of a given container. In this case, the container I'm looking at is a folder called Table Basics. And this is sort of like the query browser. It's kind of giving you a look at all of the queries that might be used in Table Basics. It's all the queries that Table Basics knows about and can see. And so I often use the analogy here that the query browser is sort of like the basement of a museum. You know, when you go to a museum and you go and look at the exhibits, you're really just looking at 10% of what's in the museum. 90% of the rest of it is all down in the basement. And that's what you're looking at here. You're looking at sort of all of the things that you might build an exhibit out of in LabKey Server. Think like anything you might present to a user. 90% of it's kind of below the surface, and you need to go surface it and show it to somebody. So actually, it's kind of nice to kind of play with this live a little bit. It's like, what are we looking at here? Well, on the left, you're looking at each one of these folders is a table group. It's called a schema. It's a group of tables. And I'm looking right now, I've opened up the lists schema. And each one of these is like a different table. There's a table called demographics. There's a table called languages, and etc. And some of these are built-in tables, but some of these are queries that I've built on top of these tables, like this physical exam query. On the right, you get a portrait of the tables themselves and details about the queries or tables themselves. And so each one of these rows is a description of a field in the query. And whether, say, it gives you the data type of the field. So this is a text field, this is an integer field, this is a date time field, etc. And it also tells you whether it's a lookup, that is, whether it has a relationship to another table. In this case, the participant ID field does have a relationship to another field. It's actually a lookup to another table, the demographics table. And then also it gives you some other metadata about the fields, like whether it's a calculated field, whether it's a PHI field, whether it's required, et cetera, et cetera. So this is sort of like your shopping area for queries, like where you're going to go, like what can I use here inside of LabKey Server. By the way, it's really worth looking around. The query browser, there's some real highlights that I think are often missed. Like, just take example, the EXP schema. This is the experiment schema. It's huge. There's all kinds of tables in here, but there's some real gems in here that you could. This is just a system table called files. Well, what is this? I mean, honestly, you could build a whole application around this table. Let's take a look at this table. Well, lo and behold, it's the table of the files I've uploaded to this folder. I didn't make this table. LabKey Server built this table for me. And it's a great way to access, like kind of an alternative UI to the file system. There's a download link. There's a file size column. There's an absolute path column. It sort of gives you all this, gives you all the goods on your files. And if you were to surface this as part of a dashboard or part of the UI for a user, you'd have yourself sort of an alternative way to interact with your files. Anyways, it's kind of inside, but just to give you a sense of kind of the richness of the query browser. So you start with the query browser, you just kind of look around, what's here? What can I do with it? Also, notice there's a whole series of tools that come inside the query browser. There's a create new query button. There's a schema administration button. This is where you would go if you're going to work with linked schemas or attach to an external database. There's a whole bunch of stuff up here. So definitely, I'm not going to go through it, but just to let you know, there's lots here to play with. Oh, okay, yeah, sure. Okay. Got signed out somehow. Well, I'm already running out of time. I don't want to go too far. And I don't even know if I have time to do my examples here, but just to give you a quick sense of maybe some of we'll give one example of actually working with LabKey SQL and building a query. Here is a very simple query on the physical exam table. And if I want to run this query, like what data does it give back? I just have to click this execute query button. Great. This is what I'm going to get back. Do I like that? Sure. If I do, I can go back to the source tab and save it. So this is sort of the development tool for building LabKey SQL. By the way, I mean, if you want some help on using the actual syntax, there is a SQL reference here that you can link to. Here's kind of the nitty-gritty of LabKey SQL. In any case, I've only got 5 minutes left, and let's leave that for questions. And if I'll nominate Joe to be my question reader here.
Any questions?
Sure.
Maybe another minute.
Yeah.
Okay. So just for others, how can one interact with ChatGPT and LabKey SQL?
Well, honestly, I've done a little bit with ChatGPT. It actually writes very effective LabKey SQL. I've actually asked it. I've been trying to just playing around with it and designing apps in LabKey. It's done very well. And I know, Joe, you've done some of that too. It's actually shocking how effective it is. I've like asked it to like, design a survey that does this and that, and it just spit out perfect LabKey SQL for me.
Yeah, like you said, I've done a little bit with that, and I've had pretty surprising success. Especially even when it doesn't give me the perfect feedback right away, it gives me a good starting point. Okay. Do you recommend writing queries directly or loading them as part of modules?
Well, actually, I think I recommend starting out with the server UI for building queries. It's easy to graduate to promote your queries into a module once you've got them going. Especially if you're new, just use the server UI. It's easy to fail. It's easy to iterate. And there's no need to start with a module. The iteration is more complex with a module. Kind of getting up and running and is not trivial. So I just start with the server UI if you want to do a module, promote it later into a module. By the way, you just copy and paste and think the actual syntax is identical. The syntax you're going to enter in the UI and the syntax you're going to enter in your module is just the same. So